So do you guys want a system? I mean, because there's this whole thing in philosophy of system building, isn't there? And there was, a lot of European philosophers have been about that. They're building kind of like an architected model of reality kind of thing. Is that something you guys are after? Do you, or do you want a kind of best possible position based on what can be known? I mean, is there an end game in mind?
Well, part of the channel's origins have this sense of like, how do we ask those questions? Like, what are the requirements of what you might call a theory of everything? And a theory of everything being something that is both the grand unifying theory in physics and a kind of theory of unified metaphysics, what I call a TUM, and the kind of unification of those two things. The origins of the channel, we have a both an educational video and a discussion about the requirements of a theory of everything. Like, what are the kind of things that give us criteria that we can even discern what's good or bad or right or wrong about a theory.
Can I, for me, definitely a big part of like what we're aiming for is, building up community skills around theories of everything and around metaphysical models, so that people have the confidence and the skills and the knowledge required to be able to, say, sample different schools of thought without getting in, I guess falling in line, lock, stock and barrel, because I think there's a tendency, and I think this is kind of what Alexander was alluding to before. It's a tendency actually that's pervasive in all thought, but it's most prevalent when it comes to totalizing systems and grand intuitions and stuff like this, which is, you have a way of construing the world, and then you come to see that way of construing the world is wrong, really wrong, deeply wrong. And so your natural reaction is like a pendulum. This is how I always think about it. You're like a pendulum. You're like, whoa, I've gone too far this way. Back the other way we go. Only you go back the other way too far again, You
overcompensate,
Exactly. And there's that tendency then to get stuck again, to get stuck on the other side, which I think, is partly what Alexander's talking about in terms of, that assertive voice, that, there's a tendency of like, when you're lost and you're looking for a way of making sense, you're looking for an alternative perspective, and you're going in the right direction, there's a tendency to settle for the first voice that's making good sense on the other side, basically, and to kind of work your way from there. Whereas I think there's some sense to, like, as you're on that swing going, okay, I'm getting some sense of this. I'm getting some sense of this. Okay, this looks like it's going too far. Back the other direction we go, and to turn that pendulum around until it equalizes in the middle, and somewhere around that equalization zone is some happy medium where you're able to go, okay, I can draw from this and this and this and this, and here is where I actually am. This is where I feel comfortable, and this is what I think it is, which is something that includes these, like that's standing on the shoulders of giants. It incorporates these insights, but here's the twist: is I see it differently, and that's the secret. That's the thing I'm after in philosophy: is that essential, that possible contribution that only a person who has individuated properly can make, because what they're doing is they're giving a piece of themselves into the mixture. They're saying, this is what I see. This is what I see.
Maybe I got a little bit caught up in the metaphor there, but I wonder whether the swing, the pendular swing that you talked about, should just continue to some degree forever. I mean, and it's not just a dimensional thing, is it? It's you can imagine it's
a dialectic,
but across many different sort of slices.
Exactly. And I think you're right that, what I think of that as is making the circle whole, making the circle even, like there's a sense in which, human beings tend towards one-sidedness. We stick to what we're good at, we avoid what we're bad at, we kind of specialize in what we know, And I think the pendulum, part of what I mean by the pendulum is this epistemological recalibration to the unknown that philosophers are always going through. And so there's a sense in which, it's always turning more around the circle. There's always more of the circle to round out, so to speak, right? And it never stops going back and forth. But the thing that I think is important is instead of going all the way up and all the way back, it's coming right to the point where you start to strain plausibility but keep the insights, and then turning around and doing the same thing on the other side. And I think there's a way in which, even though we narrow down to fit inside our heads, if we're doing this aiming for an epistemological equilibrium thing, we're getting consistent insights into the richness of reality every time we turn around, make contact and turn around.
This is fascinating. This is almost like meta philosophy. This is like saying, look, I'm offering up, or you're offering up a playbook here. This is a kind of an approach that gives you a chance to sort of give equal credibility to all of these different positions, right? It gives you a chance. Yeah. Say you're swinging through these positions. I mean, the way I approach it, I mean, again, it's not, I haven't written this down, but you're sparking some of these ideas and realizing that actually I'm doing this to a degree. But for me, it's more of a kind of like a little bit of metaphysics, a little bit of epistemology, right? And sort of, people said, Matt, you need to go and read some freaking epistemology because because you're putting your head too far above the parapet. I'm doing too much of a swing, perhaps, as you said. I was kind of like, I've been, so I had Catholicism pushed at me, so I swang well away from that, swang all the way to Dawkins and sort of like sort of 17th century clockwork mechanistic universe. And I still think there are the some of the flavour of that still does exist in science, by the way. And we can talk about scientism and things like that somewhere else, but potentially. But this is brilliant. This is really, really interesting. It's kind of like this is how we can approach it, and that's. You're writing this stuff down, aren't you?
Actually, the pendulum thing, that pendulum analogy is something that I developed in my study of synchronicity, because I see synchronicity as being like the kind of phenomenological turn back sign, when it's like, this road, what do you call it? Dead end. This road's a dead end. You know what I mean? So synchronicity is like, when you see the signs, it's like that's telling you to turn back. And specifically, it doesn't just tell you to turn back. It expresses the nature of your mistake. And if you keep driving down that road, the road ends. And so if you haven't slowed down, you hit something, and maybe you hit it hard, and then you're like, holy shit, I was totally wrong about something. My life fucking blowed up, And then you turn around and you go, fuck, I better go back that way, clearly, because,
Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say that. Sorry, Matt. You go.
I love moments like that. That's actually one of my favorite bits of conversation right there.
It's two polite Brits kind of like, after you.
This thing about synchronicity. So I put to Mike Levin once, I said, how would we, if we were part of some sort of collective intelligence, right? So, the ant's nest analogy is my favorite one. The individual units don't really know what the overarching plan of the nest is, but you can actually detect sort of what looks like a sort of singular tactical brain. You can test ants' nest behaviors and stuff. They present as kind of like a singular intelligence, interestingly. Well, arguably, right? But I'm suggesting, so I said to Mike, I said, how would you test for that if we were indeed part of some sort of collective intelligence? And he said it would come through in things like synchronicity, right? Again, we're here. We've got a mainstream scientist saying these sorts of things. So that I think that echoes what you're saying here. That it's kind of a communication that can't be rationally computed locally, but it's a message saying something.
Definitely. Actually, I had a very weird idea yesterday when I was listening to one of your talks.
Nice.
That I ended up recording it as a voice message to myself. Kind of about a collection of ideas I've been thinking about for a while. Sort of like oh fuck, the thing you were just saying. God damn it.
Collective intelligence.
Yes, but you used an example. I'm just trying to remember what the example was. Ants.
Colonial intelligence.
Yeah, kind of like that. But actually, I think a much more interesting example is mycelium and mushrooms. And fungus. Which one of the things I think is really interesting is, if mushrooms, which are the reproductive part of the mycelial network, which is underground and stretches for significant distance independently of whatever you see on the ground, if the mushrooms on the ground encounter like pathogenic bacteria or something, then the immune information from that encounter is sent through the mycelial network to all the other mushroom clusters that it makes up. And I saw some post, I think, online about talking about I guess fungal intelligence, and the thought of a line of thought of thinking around, like, I guess, like fungi as a kind of coordinating system using creatures like us to kind of cultivate consciousness, or cultivate the kind of, as a mouthpiece for its machinations and stuff. And it kind of got me thinking about, because, Mike Levin obviously is, part of the things what he studies is like regeneration in salamanders and frogs, and like the ability of an animal to know, to be able to recover and know how to heal itself and know when to stop and that kind of thing. And I guess I was kind of thinking of cases of spontaneous remission, from cancer and stuff like that, and the role played in that by positive outlook, by hope, basically. And I kind of thought it was a very strange line of thinking, but I've noticed, like, there's this set of clues around, like, the microorganisms in your gut, right? They can influence the kind of food that you want, the kind of the kind of cravings that you have, and which is really interesting, because you usually think of them as like, like almost like not even a part of you, you know what I mean? But in some way they're like pulling your strings, And I was kind of thinking to myself, like, imagine if, like, it's a strange thing to be thinking, but I was like, imagine if when you have a case of like spontaneous remission with cancer or something, such a weird thing to be thinking. I'm just going to preface that. It's so weird. But I was thinking, like, imagine if what's happening is, what in a case of spontaneous healing, there's like a cell that goes on the cell equivalent of a hero's journey, or part of the organ, or some collection of cells, some little tribal group. And then I thought this, and then I thought, now what would it be the equivalent, like the analogy of, like, the human who is the host of these cells having hope? It's like the universe is fucking smiling on you, bro.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, it's like the whole cosmos wants you to succeed, which is a very strange sort of setup for the kind of synchronicities that you're talking about, because it's like we are that thing, that macroorganism that is the home. And it's like they, like, our life is so integral for these creatures, you know what I mean? If we die, they all die too. And you can think of that as whole civilizations, you know what I mean? Like, we could have no idea what lives inside our body, what, thrives. And so, it's just this really weird sense of, like, if there were, like you were saying, if there was that kind of collective intelligence, where something's wrong, where something's out of balance, where the force isn't, to use a Jedi metaphor, when the force is out of balance, it's almost like there's a corrective aspect of the world, because, the whole organism is self-healing. And so you might, like, be playing out part of a healing process that you have no idea of, because you're just following your individual path, your individual clues, and then the completion of that hero's journey culminates in something that ends up healing your community or your country, and you didn't, there's no way you could have seen that coming. And it's just so, it really speaks to that interconnectedness I think you were pointing to before, that I think really does go beyond, I think, the materialism and the reductive scientism and stuff like that. But I guess my thought is, you can have that. We can have the richness, we can have the complexity, we can have the wonder and the opening up to the richness, without settling for something that narrows it down to something we already know. Like, why do we have to say, well, this all makes sense because it's consciousness? Instead, we could say, this is the transcendental mystery. This is the Tao. This is that thing that cannot be named. So why try to name it? Why name it consciousness? Just leave it be, like... To me, that seems more open to what it could be, rather than trying to pigeonhole it into something we think we already understand.
Well, there's some, like, with scientism and with a modern approach to trying to make sense of things, there is this desperate need to figure out the mechanisms of everything.
Yes.
And if it doesn't have a clear mechanism, then it can't be real, it can be explained away. Or
Exactly.
And even in certain communities that I'm a part of, they are more embedded in that approach of, like, oh, we could probably explain it via something, but they're more leaning towards, well, even if we can explain it by the thing, is it more beneficial to actually believe in the magic of it, or in the unknown, than it is to try and to just kind of put it away or put it aside because we can explain it? And I think that's the mistake that people tend to make. It's like, oh, because we can point to, correlations or whatever, brain states, whatever it is, then we should just put it aside and not think about it.
Yeah, I think that's like the queerness of the placebo effect, and like what is possible really if you I've always thought that's such an intriguing line of scientific research that it's very hard to imagine how you pursue it, because like if you know it's a placebo, then it doesn't really work. But it's also like so strange that just thinking something can have a medicinal effect. And then I really feel like there's so much possibility there to explore that we haven't unlocked yet.
Right. I mean, that's just absolutely spot on. And, there's this, again, Levin quoted this guy who had horrendous kind of eczema. He had kind of necrotic tissue on his arm and all sorts. And some hypnodermatologist just persuaded this infection to go. But I think what was interesting about that was it seemed to shift this kind of negativity somewhere else. And the guy then reported depression and things like this. So, it's kind of like, can you... And interestingly, that hypnodermatologist, then he went off and studied psych. He said, well, no, we've got to fix minds.
Well,
exactly as you're saying.
Exactly right.
The whole mind-body thing is just... It's phenomenal what can be done. I mean, I even try and do it myself. I'll fess up that I try to get into a meditative state and I try and focus my energies and stuff, whatever the fuck that means, right? On my bad knee. And I was doing this for a few weeks and it seemed to clear up. It got, it could well have been that it was just a passage of time and I was rubbing it and massaging it and all this kind of stuff as well. But, I think that, there is something in this.
No, definitely.
Because as you say, we're just, what do you think we are? Are we, because we're obviously a collective entity, right? So say that, our organs and stuff have their own local dynamics, their own local agency, right? They're making decisions locally. So are we, what are we? So a question of identity, what's your view on personal identity?
Feels like a big topic.
Sorry, I hope you don't mind.
Like my instinct is to localize with science. That's usually my instinct, is to localize with science. But another instinct, maybe a more mythological instinct, is to say something like we are, a sleeping giant robot or something like that. It really is like that though. That occasionally wakes up and goes, "Whoa, look at this!" This is so crazy, and then goes back to sleep and just does the rest of its tasks asleep every day, asleep. And it's only rarely that we wake up to ourselves and see ourselves for a moment and then back to sleep.
I had a weird one earlier, just going up and down those stairs. I go up and down the stairs. The only reason I'm not obese is because I'm up and down those stairs because I forget. And I thought, as I was going up and down, you're in motion. I was thinking, what am I at this moment? And I realised that I was very little, actually. And quite often when I'm going about my business, I'm not here in the same sense in which I'm here now, because I'm having to stay alert and listen to what you guys are saying. I'm in a kind of philosophical mode, right? And is that more? Do you think, in some sense, that's a more authentic state than just going up and down the stairs? Okay, but how is it preferential in some sense? I'm after. What is? Again, it's about the argument for philosophy, isn't it?
For sure.
Because you probably face the same kind of thing. You're overthinking everything. Just crack on and just enjoy yourself.
For sure.
Just curious.
I love digging into things that other people assume, it's just self-evident or it's obvious or something like that. Have you ever read a thinker called Colin Wilson?
No.
I would definitely recommend him. He does some exposition of a guy called Gurdjieff. So Gurdjieff talked about this concept that the human being is a robot. He spends his whole life asleep. That's kind of what I was paraphrasing there a little bit. Ouspensky, one of his students, is a great progenitor of this conception, and he has a technique that he supposedly learned from Gurdjieff, although other students of Gurdjieff question the validity of his interpretations, but I personally find him very illuminating. And so the technique he learned from Gurdjieff, he calls self-remembering, and he kind of describes it like, it's like imagine you're looking at a watch, and you can kind of look at the watch, or you can kind of look inward at yourself and observe yourself in this state. And then you can, if you try really hard, you can kind of look at the watch and look at yourself looking at the watch. He calls this self-remembering. And he kind of talks about how cultivating this state. And the thing I love about Colin Wilson's exposition of this is he does a great job of explaining why it makes sense to have the robot. And he kind of talks about how, when I'm first learning something, like it's very laborious. Like when I'm learning to type on a keyboard, you know, I have to coordinate all of that movement manually. You know, I have to think about every keystroke and all of that. And then over time, it becomes something that I can do automatically. Like I can just think of what I want to say, and then and that's an example of where something's being assimilated by a part of you that Colin Wilson calls the robot, you know? And he kind of says, this is really useful because obviously we want to free up our attention to do more important things. Like we don't want to have to think about every single keystroke, etc. But he kind of says, but there are some things that I don't want the robot to do for me, right? Like when I first hear a beautiful piece of music, you know, like I really listen to it. But by the second time, it's like started to become mechanicalized, you know what I mean? And there's this pervasive tendency to kind of let the robot do everything, you know, to live in a state of sleepwalking where everything you do is automatic and robotic, and you barely ever wake up and appreciate and taste life, you know, have that sapience, that taste. And so Gurdjieff and Ouspensky and Colin Wilson to some degree, part of the pattern of that set of ideas is how to wake up, how to awaken this sleeping giant to be aware of itself, to realize, to self-remember, and to stay awake.
I actually have a story that an experience that happened recently that kind of exemplifies this. Where I woke up pretty early in the morning. I couldn't sleep, so I just I was looking at the Kurt Joy Mangle's channel. I think he was talking to Ian McGilchrist, so I'd listened to Ian McGilchrist talking about the master and the emissary and the left and right hemispheres and the kind of relationships there. And then when I actually got up, I was taking a shower and I was like, oh, I kind of feel like it would be really helpful and a bit groggy to have a cold shower, like turn the cold tap on. But then a part of me was just like, turned the taps off and left. And I was like, wait a minute, who's in control here? Like, what's going on? Like, why didn't I have that cold shower? And I was like, there's a part of me that is sort of the default part that sort of exists in the world, almost like the space-time component of myself that just that can just get on with things, this robot sensing it. And then there's a part of me that's like trying to influence that part. It's kind of like, hey, wait a minute, can you just do this for a second? And quite often, if I'm not in a particular state, or like if I'm groggy, then I'm not listening to myself. And that really got me thinking, like, well, how do I make sure that I'm listening to myself? Because I feel like the robot is almost like a future orientated hedonist, or well, depending on my upbringing, I guess I'm definitely a hedonist. But my robot is, seeks comfort, seeks fat and sugar, and it has this level of conditioning that I know isn't necessarily the best thing for me. So I'm like, well, how do I train these other parts of me in order to be able to take over that? And I guess there's willpower there, and I could talk about will in terms of like will to power, or even Schopenhauer's eternal will or whatever. But free will as well. There's a conversation about free will in there probably too.
Before we even get there, that's just fascinating, this idea of this multi-agential nature of ordinary minds. So setting aside multiple personalities, and so on, we're already multi-agential. You said there's a part of me that wants to sort of influence these other areas of myself, and which one of me is in charge, and when we make decisions, it's almost like there's a conference, a round table conference between all these different points of view, different Matthews, right? Or Matt, and I find this stuff quite puzzling, and I put the question to Robert Prenter the other day. I said, this can be quite troubling area of thought, can't it? Because the sort of naive, realist, or colloquial view of identity is that it's this continuous kind of space-time meatloaf, that kind of extends. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, it's me. That's me experiencing all of these different things. But in truth, that's probably not the case.
Well, yeah.
There's the William James quote, isn't there? Thoughts are thinkers. And actually, there was a fascinating interview with Mike Levin and a guy practicing psychiatrist, and they were talking about schizophrenic voices and unwanted thoughts and things like this. And they're treated as pathology, and they don't address the voices. They think, oh no, that's the illness. We've got to sort out why that's there. But this, with Mike Levin's thoughts, this psychiatrist had kind of encountered some of his thinking. I'm thinking, well, maybe we should address them directly. If these voices are, they've got a Markovian boundary. They're trying to self-perpetuate in some sense. They have a goal, right? And their goal is to get some airtime, I guess. Perhaps you could say.
To be
it's
heard.
like, and me, over, it's like me, you know, like the little kids saying, and me kind of thing.
Exactly that. That's a really intuitive thing to say, to get some airtime. That's exactly what that kind of thing is about, is if you habitually repress parts of yourself, they will manifest against your will and get that airtime that you deny them, you know?
But they were actually based on this thinking and this kind of, you know, philosophical approach to the problem, perhaps. Interesting conversation there. They said, well, let's try this avatar therapy. So what they would do is, instead of ignoring the voice, they said, well, let's actually give it a physical manifestation. So talk to that freaking doll or something, right? And then, you know, get to a point where the voices are associated with that object, and then slowly but surely phase the object out. Right. I mean, you know, Alexander, I mean, you work as I mean, does this make any sense?
Yeah, there's a bunch of different therapies that kind of like there's sand tray therapy, where you work in a sand pit and you bring in different objects that are like, often sand tray therapists will have like a whole shelf of all these different kinds of symbols and objects and teddies and dolls and whatnot. And they encourage the client to pick things off in order to, and put them in the tray and kind of relate to them as the different voices, different parts of themselves. And and you know, Jung also had his own, you know, whole model of this, right? Like the shadow is the domain of our rejected parts, you know, it and synchronicity for Jung, and I think that we're kind of adopting a lot of this stuff as well when we talk about synchronicity in a more modern context. Is it's almost like there's a part of us that is like, hey, listen, and trying to point us somewhere, and it literally is just like the parts of us that we've, you know, been taught that aren't okay.
No, yeah, exactly right.
So could it be the case that, you know, the three of us here having this philosophical conversation, is it the case that there's a philosophical component of us that's won the battle? You know, we could have gone down many other. You see what I mean? Those other guys are still in there
winning.
Maybe. Well, yeah. Well, you know. Well, we're here discussing philosophy, so at the moment it's doing it.
But now,
what's the nature of like group work? I think like people coming together consistently over time to sit with each other and with acknowledgement of the third thing that is the group entity and the possibilities of the people joining together that, you know, generate that thing, and the approach to, you know, listening and sharing from authenticity and risking, you know, like, oh, maybe someone, you know, their shadow is someone getting loud, so I'm going to get loud right now, and that's just I'm capable of doing that, but that brings up something for them, and, you know, like that's whatever the group actually does to then, you know, integrate those experiences is skill, and I think there's a psychotherapeutic skill to that. But yeah, I think that us gathering here now is kind of like maybe the first of many versions of that, where we're actually just like talking rather than, we're not necessarily doing kind of synchronistic work, but in some sense we are at the same time, because we're just talking about what's coming to our minds. And I like to think of it that way.
Yeah, is it possible? That's an interesting one. Is it possible to create the conditions in which synchronicities are more likely to emerge? You know, that's you know,
well, that's in Sync's domain.
I actually was taught by a guy whose whole thing was how to do this. So he'd been studying synchronicity for 30 or 40 years, and I worked with him for about a year and learned pretty much everything he knew about synchronicity and a whole bunch of stuff he knew about Jungian psychology. And the answer is yes. I not only like do I know in terms of like I've had it told to me, that would never satisfy me. You know, I myself, part of my study is to experiment with it myself, to experience and to use my experiences as my primary form of evidence. And in my experience, you can't make it happen, but you can create the conditions that are more conducive to its happening. And getting
you can
together
control your response. You can control your response to it as well.
Yes,
and then compare a positive response with this is when I respond. This is when I ignore it. You know.
And I think one of the things that I do personally to create the conditions for it is to get together with other like-minded, you know, kindred spirits who have that love of learning and of looking beyond what they know or what they think they know. And I think there's a certain kind of magic that becomes possible when you get enough of those people together and you have those repeated interactions where, you know, it's almost like I can't think of another way of expressing it than this, even though this has quite prominent religious overtones. But, where two or three gather in my name, there I am. There is something of that kind of spirit, Holy Spirit, some kind of something transcendent that visits and is part of this participation we all take part in, where it's inspired. Yeah, that's the only way to think about it, is that and inspire literally means, by the way, it comes from the word for something outside you breathing in you. Inspire, respire. Like the meaning of inspire is like some deity comes and speaks through you. That's inspired. And these days, obviously we would want a more secular conception, but still there is that primitive metaphor of inspiration is something transcendent, immanent, that's kind of talking through me, or guiding me, or some muse. A muse is another way. An artist might talk of their muse. That's the same idea, really. Like I'm taking something of this ethereal being and using it in my music, and it's making it better.
But there's something using us as well, right?
Yeah.
Right. So Alexander, you mentioned the sort of collective identity, this idea of the group. Was it Nietzsche that said that, humans go mad in groups as opposed to as individuals, there's something in that, isn't there? So what do you guys think is going, what is it?